Yes, Namaskar, Tashdele. Good morning to our friends in Northern America, and good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good evening to our friends in Taiwan, Japan, and late good evening to our friends in Melbourne. So today, as we all know, the subject of our discussion today is hopes and possibilities for a free Tibet in the present international scenario. And the reason for picking up this subject this time is that today is the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan People's Uprising, which happened in 1959 on 10th March. It started in Lhasa and then spread to all over Tibet. So today is the eve of that day. I will give you a very short introduction in the beginning of the organizing groups and then an introduction to our honored speakers. And then we will shift to our speakers. So, as most of us know already, there are two organizers of this event: the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, which in short we call CHASE, and Tibetan Youth Congress, which again in short is known very popular as TYC. CHASE is a think tank which is focused on understanding issues which are impacting countries and societies in and around Himalayan Asia region. It's a platform for exchange of knowledge, views, perspectives among Indian and Tibetan and international experts, researchers, writers, and such advocacy groups who take keen interest on various aspects of political, social, economic, and strategic developments in this region. And then, as we know, Tibetan Youth Congress is worldwide organization of Tibetan diaspora, which has a long history of 50 years, and it has evolved itself as a common focal point of the struggle of Tibetan people in a non-violent way. And it's a non-government organization which believes in full and complete independence of whole of Tibet. And whole of Tibet means Cholka Sum, which includes Utsang, Kham, and Amdo. And as uh, TYC is known for, yeah, it has evolved as a, a very prominent and a unique nursery of developing talents among the Tibetan diaspora. If we go and see the list of who's who, the elected presidents or Sikyongs, Kalan Tripas, and ministers and parliamentarians, judiciary, journalists, political leaders, social leaders, all of them have had their training while working as TYC volunteers. So today we are honored to have some very prominent speakers who are experts in their own fields. Um, if I start with Mr. Pierre Antoine Donnet, he is a veteran French journalist and he's an expert on China. As a journalist, he has had a long experience in reporting and writing about China. He has been posted in Beijing for quite a long time from 1984 to 1989 as a correspondent in the news bureau of agency AFP. And during 1980s, he also served as AFP's global chief news editor. Mr. Donnet is quite famous as an author and a specialist on China. He has written a few books on China and Tibet, more than two books. His first book was on Tibet, which was titled Tibet, Dead or Alive, and it was published in 1990. And his latest book, which has gained world attention, is titled China, the Great Predator, and it was published in 2021. He studied Chinese language during 1980s in Paris, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So his constant touch with China keeps him aware of all the developments. So that makes him a very special speaker today. So welcome, Mr. Done.
Namaste.
Namaste. And then we have Kai Mueller. Um, Kai Mueller is the executive director, yeah, executive director of the International Campaign for Tibet, Germany, and he has been holding this position since 2005. He coordinates ICT's UN-related advocacy, and he has testified before Parliament and the United Nations human rights bodies quite regularly on issues related to Tibet and China. By training and education, he is a jurist and a social scientist with specialization in social studies, political science, and public administration. And as we all know, ICT, the International Campaign for Tibet, promotes the self determination and the human rights of Tibetans, and it maintains offices in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and Amsterdam. Kai is holding office in Berlin, in Germany. Our another valued speaker is Ms. Eleanor Bayan Rosengren. She will be joining us very soon because she has had to attend another meeting, and when I spoke to her, she was driving back home. So she will join us as soon as she reaches home. Eleanor is currently a steering committee member of International Tibet Network, which is known as ITN, and she has been a co-founder of Tibet Solidarity UK. Earlier, she has been a former director of Free Tibet in United Kingdom, and she's also secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet in the Scottish Parliament, and is the campaign manager for Scottish Green Party. So she wears many caps. Uh, Her background is a law. She has had a law degree and MA in human rights, and she spent time in private sector working also in fields like project management, business development, and equality and diversity consultancy. And then we have Namgyal Dolkar Lagyari, who is a very prominent Tibetan leader, if I can use the term youth leader. She is among the prominent Tibetan parliamentarians uh, in the Tibetan parliament in exile, and she has been former president of Guchusum, which is a which plays a very special role and has a very special personality, because Guchusum is the association of former Tibetan political prisoners, uh, and she is based in Dharamsala. She she spearheaded the legal empowerment project in Tibetan Women Association. She has been very active with Tibetan Women Association, and currently she is also serving as the vice president of FIPA, which is Free Indo-Pacific Alliance, which is composed of members from Tibet, Southern Mongolia, sorry, Southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc. So welcome Namgyal Dolkar Lagyari, and uh, our another colleague Ayushi Ketkar, who would be joining us very soon. She is Professor Ayushi Ketkar. She is Oh, yeah, she's here. Welcome, Ayushi. She is assistant professor at the Special Center for National Security Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, popularly known as JNU in New Delhi. She specializes in international relations and security matters. She has been earlier associated with the prominent universities like Gautam Buddha University in Greater Noida, Amity University, Symbiosis, and Bhosla Military College, Nashik. So, and she is also associated with the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and Jammu Kashmir Studies Center. So, welcome, Ayushi.
Thank you, sir.
And last but not least, another important member of our team today is Ms. Tenzin Ramo. Welcome Tenzin Lamula. She is the Tibetan Youth Congress Information Secretary and works from Dharamsala. And she has been involved very actively in the activities of Tibetan Youth Congress. And her main assignment is to promote the information generated by the activities of Tibetan Youth Congress. And so, welcome Tenzin Lamula.
Thanks, sir.
So now to start, may I request Namgyal Dolkar Lagyari to please, because as the Tibetan speaker, we would love to have from you the perspective, Tibetan perspective of today's, actually it is tomorrow, the very special day, 10th March, when in 1959, the Tibetan people rose up against the colonial occupation of Tibet by China. So I leave the floor to Lagyari Namgyal Dolkar. Please.
Thank you, Vijaykanthiji, and I want to offer my greetings to the esteemed panelists. It's an honor that I'm sharing the screen space with you, and I will be sharing my little bit of experience and opinion as a Tibetan activist, as a daughter of a former political prisoner, and a new generation of Tibetan elected leader in exile. So the topic that we are covering today is hopes and possibilities for a free Tibet in the present international scenario. I think I would like to, as Vijay Kanteji said, I would like to provide my perspective in terms of how I see a hope and possibility for a free Tibet. Of course, as an activist, I am optimist. I am optimist, and we try to be as vigorous as we can for the movement because we see a possibility, we see a hope. So if I may just go back into the history of how the forceful annexation of the sovereign Tibet by the so-called People's Liberation Army led to genocide of more than 1 million Tibetans. A number, according to many researchers, continue to rise under Chinese Communist Party's occupation. So on this day, Chinese leadership tries to legitimize its occupation by manipulating the history of Tibet, by claiming that Tibet has been part of China since time immemorial. So for me, amongst all the bizarrely false claim of CCP, the most widely owned CCP narrative is its quote of how Tibet was part of China during Yuan and the Qing dynasty. While the Yuan dynasty is the Mongolian rule of China in the early 13th century, the Qing dynasty is the Manchu ruler of China in the 17th century, which extended its control over major areas in Asia, which included Tibet. So Tibet was declared independent from both these rulers, both these dynasties, who weren't, I think, those regimes, during their control, they extended the freedom of Tibet, if I can put it that way. But interestingly enough, both these dynasties are clearly, and something that the CCP leadership has to understand is that they aren't Han Chinese. So this is something that Chinese Communist parties continue to claim. So for me, I always see it as how, if I can put it that way, it's like how if an Australian can claim New Zealand as part of Australian territory simply on the argument of how the Britishers ruled over both the territories once. So I see that as bizarre and absolutely without reason. That's how I see it. So despite China's promise of granting freedom of religion and equality to Tibetans during the 17 Peace Point Agreement, which was made under duress. In this more than 70 years, not only was our most beloved and respected religious and temporal leader, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, was forced to leave his fatherland, Payul, under a very dire circumstances, with a small section of the Tibetan community in exile. Almost 4 generations of Tibetans are now suffering under Chinese dictatorial colonial empire. So the Chinese leadership has been attempting to completely wash off Tibetan history and Tibetan identity under a different Chinese communist leadership, and now it has become completely, I would say, intolerant and systematically militarized under Xi Jinping. So right now, how I see is CCP is allocating huge investments and resources on technologies to strengthen Xi Jinping and CCP's control and its power stability. So Tibetan natural resources and our land are exploited at a speeding rate to boost China's economy, which of course in turn facilitates China's military expansionist ambition over not just the occupied territories like Tibet, but its own people in China, as we have witnessed that during the COVID time, but also around the world, as we are looking into Indo-Tibet border against India and also the Taiwan Strait. Despite, I would say that despite CCP's claim that there is no Tibet issue, this is how they put it, that there is no Tibet issue, I would say that Tibet-China conflict remains unresolved. It is an unresolved issue, and the Tibetan population have an undisputed right to self-determination, which basically means that it shouldn't be in the hands of CCP leadership or the world to decide what happens to Tibet, but Tibetan people ourselves decide what happens to the land that we own as per history and evidence. So CCP declaring that Tibet as part of China under this so-called one China policy, or any nation, including India, United States, UK, European countries, or anyone, abiding and reiterating one China policy is completely unethical and nonsense. So Tibetans in occupied Tibet and diaspora under His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile for decades have resisted China's military powers and its shrewd assimilation policy of, I would say, eradicating Tibetan voices with utmost resilience and strength. And if we study the most recent revelation report on Chinese government's policy on occupied Tibet, Chinese leadership is forcing about 800,000 to 900,000 young Tibetan students from the age of 6 to 18, as well as a huge number of young Tibetan children around 5 years of age into a vast network of colonial boarding schools, where these Tibetan children are separated from their Tibetan parents, and they are schooled under these colonial boarding schools. So the whether schools or whether it's universities or villages or I would say whether it's towns, any monastic institution, nunnery, basically every grassroots level are surveilled heavily by CCP, and what we're looking into is how it's surveilled with every possible human or technological assistance. And we are looking into how those areas of grassroots level where there's heavy indoctrination happening from CCP leadership. So these are enabled by CCP leadership only to surveil and only to control any potential resistance that can happen against their power, their rule. And also we've been hearing about this mass DNA collection across Tibet, particularly in the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, to enhance CCP's surveillance capacity. And similar actions have been conducted in, we've found research and report about how there have been similar research where that is conducted in East Turkestan, in occupied East Turkestan as well in the past. So we see a similar trend happening, how this leadership, Chinese dictatorial leadership, is applying this rule across all its occupied regions and making sure whatever policies that are successful in one occupied region are implemented and practiced across other occupied regions as well. So, but despite all these things, but despite all the pressure and these policies, ruthless policies, we have witnessed over the decades uprisings. We have recorded resistance and power and energy-packed movement in Tibet over the years by Tibetans, which for me sets an example of how a fight of truth, a fight of, if I can put it that way, if a fight of reality resonates, so evidence of, for me, one thing that has been spoken about Tibetan freedom movement is how it's more about emotion and less about reasoning. But I've always reiterated that our evidence of decades and reasoning actually direct us towards a conclusion without a single blink that Chinese leadership, particularly under Xi Jinping, cannot be trusted under any circumstances. And I would say that as a Tibetan activist, that we have witnessed that. And hence it is important as a Tibetan that I reach out to other nations, other individuals of what Chinese Communist Party is capable of from the examples of occupied nations like Tibet myself. So if I can conclude myself, considering the fact that tomorrow is 10th March, it's the Tibetan uprising day. It's a day when we saw the first ever Tibetan, where Tibetan people rose up against Chinese Communist Party and its control. I always say that I find, as an activist, I find myself renewing my pledge, my promise of service and dedication for Tibet and its freedom movement. However, 10th March, I find it as a unique and symbolic day when Tibetans and Tibet supporters as a community, we take a collective pledge and reiterate our collective voice as as new generation of activists standing up against Chinese Communist Party, standing up for Tibetan freedom movement. So I would say that several generations of Tibetans, since the illegal occupation of Chinese colonial regime, have demonstrated a utmost degree of strength, of tenacity and resilience. And until Tibet is free and a democratic nation, this, for me, I believe, shall continue. This strength shall continue. The Tibet cause is fundamentally, I truly believe that it's it's honestly just not a cause for only Tibetans or other occupied nations like Uyghurs or Southern Mongolians, but it's a larger cause of the humanity, where our shared voice for freedom, for I would say for human dignity and our respect for human rights is challenged. So I would request the Tibetans across the world. I would request all the Purba. I would request the Uyghurs, our Southern Mongolian friends, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, even Chinese, and every human rights loving individual to please come out and come out tomorrow on 10th March and join the protests with the Tibetan organizers in your area, anywhere across the world, in any country that you reside in, and please come out and support the Tibetan cause, the Tibetans inside Tibet. And if I can tell you this, we as a community, as humanity, we shall overcome this. We shall overcome this dictatorial regime together, and this is where our strength shall lie. We have retained our hope and our pride, as well as determination to basically never give in. And if I can just wrap it up, I would say that Tibet is a cause and a nation. In the Tibet as a cause and a nation is not only alive, but its spirit is thriving and determined to see a future of a nation, of a Tibet that is free and democratic. So I would say, yes, we're thriving and we haven't given up. Thank you, Vijayji.
Thank you, Namgal Dolkar Lagyari. And your presentation not only gives the right background to why the Tibetans and their friends and freedom-loving people are going to observe tomorrow as a special day for human rights and freedom. Um, your presentation is, I find, because my association with Tibet is now in the 50th year, and incidentally, tomorrow will be 49th of 10th March, which I personally would be observing personally. So I find your presentation as a very promising one when it comes from a young person like you, when it comes from a leading politician of Tibetan diaspora. So thank you very much for making this a very promising kind of note. So thank you very much. And now we are coming to another expert, Mr. Done, who understands China like both sides of his hand. He has seen China very closely while sitting in Beijing as a correspondent, as a journalist. And in later years, as I said earlier, he has been studying and observing China very closely. And as an author of a very celebrated book on Tibet, Mr. Done is the right person to give us a perspective of an observer who is sitting outside and watching these things so closely. Mr. Done, please.
Thank you, Mr. Karanti. And thank you, Ms. Namdol. Your speech was very positive. And I must say that I agree with you in the fact that the will of the Tibetan people is still intact, despite all the sufferings since the occupation started in 1950. Having said that, I would like to talk a little bit about the present situation within China, because the evolution is quite amazing. The CCP is now more than 100 years old, so it has a long experience, and it had overcome many challenges. And I suppose that the CCP will be here for another long time. Nobody knows for how long, but it's going to be here for a long time, that's for sure. But having said that, there were several interesting facts recently that shows that the regime, the communist regime in Beijing, is a bit nervous. And when I say a bit nervous, this is an understatement. I think they are quite nervous. And that started a few years ago, but it had gone more and more obvious in the last few months. One sign was, of course, the demonstrations in more than 20 cities in China against the COVID management, which was just awful for the Chinese population. And we saw hundreds, if not thousands of young people, young students, demonstrating in the streets and shouting for some of them, down with the CCP, down with Xi Jinping. And that was the first time in a very long period of time. That reminded me of the Tiananmen Square massacre back in 1979. And we also witnessed that some Chinese people in the streets were shouting one slogan, which for me it's quite interesting, saying, "We are all Uyghurs." Why that? Because the news that 10 people died in Urumqi because of a fire, and because these people could not escape, because the door from the apartment was shut out, so they died, and that news went all around China and really caused a stir. Then after that, there was a U-turn, and a sudden U-turn. In a matter of 2 or 3 days, suddenly, all this COVID management disappeared, almost all of it. And that was quite surprising because usually the CCP is taking decisions after a long period of thinking. What will be the consequences of the decision that we are about to make? And then we saw that very suddenly, there was a U-turn. That was a sign that there is some kind of nervousness within the CCP leadership. And then another sign came out during the CCP Congress, when we saw Xi Jinping in the middle of course, the arena there, but we saw his predecessor, Mr. Hu Jintao, taken out of the rostrum, and we saw his face that he couldn't understand what was happening. And we also saw, and that was interesting, that Mr. Hu Jintao had a red document. And the first thing the two people who approached him did, they took this document and out of him. And that was a sign that maybe inside there was a speech that he was going to make, and possibly to make his point that the direction undertaken by Xi Jinping is not all good. There may be some criticism to be done. So he was silenced. And that was actually without precedent since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. And just recently, a few days ago on Tuesday, there was another sign of quite a big nervousness within the CCP leadership when Xi Jinping and also his new foreign minister, Mr. Qin Gang, made a long speech. And these two speeches, for the first time, they condemned, namely, the United States of doing coercion against China, and in very strong words, which also they accused the West of siding with the United States, which is also unprecedented. So that shows this is another clear sign that they are very nervous. So why are they nervous, actually? There are several reasons, but one of the reasons is that facing China, there are more and more countries siding together to face China, to face the threat coming from the CCP and the Chinese army. And among them, of course, there is the United States. But together with the United States, there is now Japan, And the Japanese government just 1 month ago made it very clear that the military budget is going to go up from 1% of the GDP now to 2% of the GDP in 5 years' time. This is also quite new. It's unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. Why are they doing that? Because they realize, as other countries also do, that the threat coming from the Chinese army and also from the CCP is going up. It has been going up all the time in the last 10, 20 years. And this was shown very clearly with the threats against Taiwan. So, having said that, we also saw the American government warning China not to sell weapons to Russia. And the warning also is a sign that in Washington they are worried. Because if the Chinese leadership, among them, of course, Xi Jinping, because he is the one who is going to do the decisions, if they do sell weapons to Russia, that would be a game changer. Are they going to do that or not? Frankly speaking, it's very hard to say. But one thing is very clear, is that the cooperation between Russia and China, with the years passing, are closer and closer. And in February the 4th, when Mr. Putin went to Beijing for the opening of the Winter Games in Beijing, he, of course, met Xi Jinping. He met him actually a few dozen times. They are good friends. They are saying that as well themselves. But after meeting together, about 4 hours meeting, they announced that from now on, the cooperation between China and Russia has no limits. This is also unprecedented. So no limits, it's vague, but also it leaves the door open to maybe, possibly, selling arms to Russia. If they do that, immediately Western sanctions, which are applying on Russia, will also target China. And they know that, of course, in Beijing. So if they do that, if the sanctions are targeted against China, this would come at a very bad moment for the Chinese economy, because you all know that the GDP growth is going down. In 2022, it was 5%, 3%, I'm sorry, 3% officially, but probably much less than that. This is also unprecedented in more than 40 years. So all this to say that we are witnessing a very delicate moment. Whether the Chinese leadership will decide to cross the red line and to side openly with Russia on the military front. Very soon, Xi Jinping will probably go to Moscow for an official visit. This has been announced by the Russian side. It hasn't been confirmed yet by the Beijing side, by the Chinese side, but very possibly he will go there. If he goes there in the middle of the Russian war in Ukraine, that would also be quite a step, leading to more awareness in the West of what is the Chinese leadership doing today. And I'm going to actually talk about this awareness. Just previously, the Tibetan lady who spoke said that the will of the Tibetan people is still intact. I do agree with that. I'm not Tibetan, but I'm seeing that. For many reasons, I'm seeing that. All the support groups which have been created long time ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, most of them are still here and new ones are being created. And I'm doing a parallel with the Uyghur, because there are quite a few identical facts between the Uyghur and the Tibetans. First of all, the eastern Turkestan became the Xinjiang with the invasion of the Chinese army in 1950. It was the same as for Tibet. It was in October 1950 when about 80,000 Chinese soldiers started the invasion of Tibet. And for a period of time, it was a bit quiet in Xinjiang, while in Tibet, the repression started immediately. But recently, in 2015, the harsh repression of the Uyghur people started under the guidance of Mr. Xi Jinping. That this would not be known abroad. But it's just the opposite. Now, the Uyghur treatment is known everywhere in the West and in lots of other countries. Unfortunately, within China, the Chinese population is under very heavy disinformation campaign all the time. So they are quite ignorant about the situation in Xinjiang and also in Tibet. That is to say that the opinion of the Chinese people will remain the same for the time being. But outside, there is a growing awareness within the West, but not only the West, also in African countries, in the Middle East, also in Latin America, on what is China doing these days and what are the prospects of the threats coming out of from China. So I would like to conclude that it's very hard for me to really predict what will be the future of Tibet and also for the Uyghur. Because the regime, as I said at the opening of my remarks, the Chinese CCP regime is solid. It has the support of a large section of the Chinese population. That's obvious. There is no doubt about this. But China is now facing a growing number of countries who realize that they have to prepare themselves to face China. So what is going to happen? Nobody really knows, but we are witnessing a very crucial time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Donay, the way you have explained how the world is now rising up and realizing the danger of China, and especially China under CCP and President Xi Jinping. So that gives us a very good perspective of that. Although many people believe that China is very strong, very powerful, and the world will take dictations from China, but as you have explained very logically, that the world is waking up, and even countries like Japan, who used to have a, as we understand, a defense policy which was very, soft, is now rising up and doubling up, as you explained, the defense budget. So that shows, sorry, that shows that President Xi Jinping and CCP have, by their own actions, created an environment that the whole world is now understanding the danger from their policies and their existence. So let us hope that this trend is going to pick up, and world would be safer, not because of China learns lesson, because the whole world gets united against this tyranny. So thank you very much, Mr. Donnet. And now I request our friend Kai Mueller, who has been very actively, as I explained earlier, following the Tibetan issue and presenting the Tibetan case before some of the highest platforms, international platforms like United Nations, the Human Rights Council. So, Mr. Kai Mueller, we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vijay Kranti, and thank you, Chase and Tibetan Youth Congress, for inviting me to speak here today. And I think it's quite a undertaking to respond to today's subject, hopes and possibilities for a free Tibet in the present international scenario. I will try to offer some sketches, while I think a lot of remarks have already been made by Mr. Donnet and also by Namgyala on Tibet and China itself, and plus the international environment. I would like to just perhaps expand a little bit on the international environment and pick up from where Mr. Donnet left, and go a little bit into some details, some observations I have been making over the past year or months, even with regard how distinctively the European perception of China has changed, is changing, and may change in the near future, which will also have a tremendous impact, I believe, on the Tibet conflict. First of all, as we all know, the dominating and massively impacting development in Europe is the war from Russia against the Ukraine, which of course China's role is crucial to. Question is, how does China's positioning affect European international view on China and its policies towards Tibetans and Uyghurs? First of all, there may be a likelihood that some governments in Europe put hope into a potentially constructive role of the Chinese government in this war by means of negotiating, pushing Russia towards a constructive or let's say peaceful or retreat even from hostilities and from the Ukrainian territory. This may lead governments, and I'm thinking of my own specifically, to the assumption that the governments here in the West should be more cautious in how much they address human rights issues of rule over Tibetans and Uyghurs, for example. We have been particularly concerned about our Chancellor Scholz's visit to Beijing last year, because we believed that he would trade in what some would perceive as empty promises or, self-evident statements from Xi Jinping with regard to use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine from the side of Russia. So we have been concerned that over this hope and assumption, our government would drop all issues with regard to Tibetans, Uyghurs, and their situations. In the meantime, I personally believe that this is less likely to happen because, as Mr. Donnet already also stated, from my point of view, there is a gradual realization in the West and among political stakeholders, decision makers, that China is in fact actively, at least politically and diplomatically, a close ally of the Russian regime, and that it's actively supporting Russia instead of taking up this position as a honest negotiator between the warring parties, or a influencer on the Russian position that would be constructive. And this falls together with, I think, with a growing perception that China, the CCP, actually is a opponent of the international order as it is, the liberal international order. And the recent statements confirm this trend. The statements from this week from Xi Jinping and also the new foreign minister of China. And we can also clearly see it on the ground at the United Nations level, at the Human Rights Council, where China continues to attempt to undermine definitions, standards, processes of acknowledged and well-established UN rights mechanisms. So this is still in full swing, and it becomes more and more obvious for observers. Going along with this, the negative example of dependency, of economic energy dependence on Russia, may lead to a understanding in the West that decoupling that diversification in terms of trade from and with China is desirable, is actually one very important takeaway from the Russian experience. In my view, this would, in the end, lead to a situation where we have less influence from corporate, from business on China policy, which is still very dominant here, at least in Germany, and I believe also in other European countries. And this declining influence of corporate interest on the formation of China policy may lead to a greater attention to the Tibetan cause and to the Uyghur cause in the near future. So there may be some hopeful developments amidst this quite concerning, I should say, international developments. Along with that, there may also be a growing realization and acknowledgement and of the role and the status of oppressed and colonized people who have been invaded, such as the Tibetans. From my perspective, from my view, there's a growing understanding of the unacceptability, of the inadequacy of of accepting a view that is perpetuated by empires, by Moscow, by Beijing, vis-a-vis the Ukrainian people, vis-a-vis the Balts, the Eastern Europeans, and alike if we look from Beijing on the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. I think the parallels are quite obvious here, and I think this may offer a new understanding in Europe coming from the Ukrainian experience, that such peoples are not merely pawns on a global geopolitical chessboard, but they constitute actors, subjects who have got their own aspirations, their own will to self-determination. This may be a step towards a better understanding and actually a more, I think, just appreciation of the situation of the Tibetan people. Tibetans as such may now, by Western countries, by Europe, be more likely be viewed as partners in values, because we note that there is growing autocracy around the world, and that this is also becoming a threat for Western countries by means of disinformation, by means of dependencies, through wars and conflict that are being initiated by those autocratic countries. So I think there may be a better appreciation of Tibetans in exile who strive to maintain a democracy under difficult circumstances and to try to maintain a value-based governance, a value-based solution and outlook on their fellow countrymen and women in Tibet themselves. Altogether, I believe, in a nutshell, there should be diverse tactics applied by the Tibetans, by Tibetan peoples, by advocates for the Tibetan cause. One should be maintain clarity in understanding and addressing what Chinese policies in Tibet constitute, what they mean. In order to develop right policies, correct policies with regard to CCP's policies in Tibet, one needs to understand the realities on the ground. This needs to be very clear and very clearly communicated. On the other hand, Tibetans, if I may humbly offer these suggestions, should continue to offer constructive solutions, to be clear, but at the same time to offer a off-ramp for the Chinese. And I would believe it would be very tragic if that be a window of opportunity for change, and there not be a credible solution being able to be formulated by Tibetans in exile or in Tibet. Those things, in my view, are interdependent. Clarity and an off-ramp for the Chinese in case such a window of opportunity opens up. All of this certainly is an investment into hope, I shall say, and very much, open. It is what may happen in the near future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Kai Mueller. The way you have explained how the thinking in Europe, which is a very, very potential player in the international games, uh, is changing its attitude and making more realization of China's reality, and also your suggestions to the Tibetans to maintain their determination, and of course, especially how China is. What China is doing inside Tibet. That is something which I think the world has to realize. So thank you very much. We have been expecting our fourth speaker, Eleanor, to join us. I am not sure if she has joined. May I ask our friend Losangla? Uh, has she joined? Oh, yeah, Eleanor is here. Welcome, Eleanor. Thank you very much. You had to make very special efforts to reach and join. I know you were traveling. So, thank you very much for being in time to join us. So, now I will request Eleanor, whom I already introduced, that she has a long experience uh, of promoting the Tibetan cause and interacting with the non-Tibetan societies in the West to promote understanding of Tibet. She has a very long uh, innings which she has played. So, Eleanor, I leave the floor to you. So, your perspective as a person who understands Tibet, who has been interacting with non-Tibetan societies of the West to present, what kind of hopes we should see for future of Tibet. Eleanor, please.
Thank you, Vijay. So I've been noticing two sides to this story. On the one hand, we've had increasingly repressive measures from the Chinese government. It's been increasingly difficult for NGOs to get information out of Tibet, to be able to communicate with sources inside the country, and there's been less and less public space for human rights defenders inside Tibet. It's been difficult for them to make communications with anyone from family and friends to NGOs or other agencies working in the human rights sphere. We've also seen the crackdown on Hong Kong, the restriction of democratic space, the national security law, which has criminalized all kinds of what were previously normal democratic activities by Hong Kongers. That particular law is a very concerning piece of legislation because there are elements of it that will apply to the actions of Hong Kongers outside of Hong Kong, which makes the surveillance operations that China has in other countries a more present danger to dissidents and asylum seekers from places like Hong Kong. So we've got that on one hand, the legislation, the crackdown, the tightening of security measures. On the other hand, and this is where things are looking more hopeful, I've noticed changing stances in various countries, but particularly in the UK, where I'm based at the moment. And I'll run through a few of those changes and developments during this presentation. But broadly speaking, they can be grouped into two categories. One of these is concerns about human rights, and the other is concerns about spying and surveillance. So I'll deal with those two first. I'm sure many people saw the recent stories in the news about the Chinese spy balloons that were flying over the United States, one of which was shot down, and then the discussion that followed on from that, and the revelation that similar Chinese spy balloons had very likely been flying over the US throughout the Trump administration and had not been recorded or dealt with. And that in itself is obviously concerning. I think there's some uncertainty exactly how long this kind of espionage has been happening. Some commentators have said it's commonplace and everyone does it. Others are saying that we should be considering Chinese espionage to be one of the greatest threats to other countries' security that we've seen in a long time. So that there are clearly different views on this issue. But I personally feel that there has been an increase in activity of this nature. People have become more aware of it and are certainly becoming more critical of it. So within the context of the UK, there's been discussion over CCTV cameras and other surveillance equipment, which the national government and local authorities are receiving from Chinese companies. Now, obviously, a number of years ago, the relationship was good, and our governments and agencies clearly thought it was absolutely fine to be buying security equipment from China and from Chinese companies. Concerns have obviously been growing, and we now have a situation where government departments in the UK have been told to stop installing any new cameras in sensitive sites, so anything to do with central government or military, to stop using these cameras, and they've been urged to disconnect any Chinese-made devices from core computer networks and to consider removing all cameras altogether. And there is a post for a commissioner of biometrics and surveillance cameras, so quite a technical post. And the commissioner here said that our public surveillance infrastructure had been built on digital asbestos. And for anyone who doesn't know, asbestos is a substance that was once quite widely used in building, and in later years, it was discovered that it was incredibly dangerous to people's health, and that it caused various life-threatening diseases. So this is what Chinese surveillance equipment is now being compared to. There was a review of police equipment, and it was found that Chinese CCTV cameras, other surveillance equipment was in widespread use across the police force. This was in England and Wales. We're yet to see if a similar review will take place in Scotland. And the recommendation was that all of this equipment is decommissioned and that the police should stop using it because of the security concerns. One of the main Chinese companies involved is Hikvision, and I know Free Tibet has a long-running campaign into the use of their equipment, and they've had a number of successes, one of which was in Edinburgh Council, which made the frightening admission that they did not actually know how many Hikvision cameras were in use in the city. And this is the capital city of Scotland. So that's clearly a very concerning situation, and all of those cameras have now been decommissioned, they will be taken down. And the concern over Hikvision and other similar equipment is twofold. Firstly, there's the concern of the data. What is the risk of the recordings taken on that equipment being sent back to China secretly? And what is the Chinese government going to do with that data? That's one concern. The other is that there was a connection, particularly in the case of Hikvision, between that equipment and work camps in East Turkestan, or Xinjiang, as some people know it, and all of the human rights abuses connected with that relationship. And the issue with Hikvision is not just being experienced in the UK. The Australian government has recently decided to remove security cameras made by Chinese firms. I believe the US has blacklisted at least one company. I'm not sure if it was Hikvision or another one. But we're seeing this around the West. And it is quite a marked difference from the way things were a number of years ago, when governments were much keener to maintain good relationships with China, and the idea of blacklisting Chinese companies or being quite honest about espionage concerns. We wouldn't have seen it a number of years ago. And going back to the situation in the UK, we've had a number of different prime ministers recently. I'll say no more about that right now. But the most recent one, Rishi Sunak, has said openly that what was referred to as the golden era of relations with China is over. He was quite clear about that. He has cautioned against anyone using Cold War rhetoric or returning to any of the ideas or attitudes that we may have seen back in those days, but that there must be a more robust and pragmatic attitude towards the relationship with China, and there's certainly going to be no more being best friends with them. He recently told an audience of business leaders, we recognize China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism, and that we must do away with the naive idea that trade would lead to political reform. So this is a very definite change in the stance, and while this in itself is not going to lead to political change within Tibet, I think it could produce a global political climate where it will be easier for advocacy groups to push for changes in government stances, and there will be an opportunity there for Tibetans to press their case um, in a more hopeful way than we've perhaps seen in the past. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. It was a very timely reference to how China has penetrated into systems physically through whether it is through their equipment, espionage equipment, or other things, and the failure of this thinking, especially in the West, that you trade with China and it will change the political culture, it will make them more democratic. This the entire West has realized now. So this is something, a very relevant point for our discussion today, because once this realization seeps the into the heads of governments, then we can expect a change in their policies, especially the trade policies, because as we know all the money which has flown from especially from the Western countries, because it was the Western countries who were attracted by the what our two great politicians, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the way they pulled in the entire West into the lap of China, the way the entire West transferred its technology, its funding, finance, and then also provided their own markets to China. And in the process, they created a Frankenstein. First, it was a financial Frankenstein. And then very quickly, it became a military Frankenstein. So you have very rightly underlined that the word is now realizing, the UK government is realizing. So let us hope that this realization is going to make difference. So now we have opinion from all our colleagues, and this is time to have a few questions. And our colleague, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who handles the question answer session for us in our webinars, I will request Ayushi to please come up with a few questions. We have about 10 to 15 minutes, and let us hope we complete this. Ayushi, please.
Thank you, sir. So, a quick question for each of the experts. Ms. Namdol, you spoke about education. So, I would like your views on how education is being used as a new imperial tool, and how do the Tibetans see this? I mean, how do you have any any master plan of overcoming this? Because I think this is a very important concern, because you see an entire generation of population being kind of socialized into some kind of an ethos where it's almost like they are missing out on their culture, on their roots, on their sense of belonging. So how do you see education impacting all that? Monsieur Donnet, you spoke about how the world has realized, a lot of countries are now disengaging or decoupling with China, and this is a realization, especially in the post-COVID world, that how China, in order to become a hegemonic power, a superpower in that sense, can go to any extent. But I want to know about the possibility of China imploding under its own internal pressures from Tibet, from Xinjiang, from Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Mongolia. So all these, people wanting independence and fighting for their nationalities. Do you see China imploding under that pressure? Mueller, sir, we've heard you many times, and it's very interesting that you always bring in some new perspective to to our engagements here at CHASE. I would want to know, you've mentioned about changes in Tibet. Since you follow this very closely, there are a whole lot of changes ranging from demographic changes, exploitation of resources, surveillance systems. So there are an entire set of things, the changes that happen. How do you see this impacting national morale and the entire Tibetan movement as such? And Eleanor, ma'am, the two, actually you and Ms. Namdol, both of you mentioned of surveillance system, and this definitely is a major concern for any political scientist or anybody even looking at a free world or wanting a free world. So in a world of technology, I want your views on how you see technology impacting democracy, because we've seen how technology, especially the social media, kind of strengthening democracy. We've seen people's journalists and those kind of aspects coming to the fore. But now you see the same technology acting as a double-edged sword and kind of curbing democracy. So I would like your views on that. And Vijay Kranti sir, as a senior, as a mentor, you've touched upon this, but I would like you to elaborate on how the world always kind of made a very strong linkage between development and democracy, and China being an oxymoron to that. We clearly see a very developed China nowhere close to being democratic. Not now, not in the near future at least. So I would like your views on that. Thank you.
Okay, so let us start with Lagyari Namdullah.
Thank you for the question, Arishi. I would say that education remains a focal point of where we are able to nurture and breed, if I can use that word, a new generation of Tibetans. When I say education, I don't just mean in schools or universities, but also for Tibetan culture. The monastic institutions have been incredibly important. We have homeschooling that has continued over centuries in Tibet, where where we have homeschooled new generations of nomads and farmers at home. So I think those have been a focal point. Those have been a thread for Chinese Communist Party for many generations, because despite its attempt, despite its pressure, we have managed over many generations to ensure that Tibetans continue to realize our history, our identity, our pride as Tibetans, our responsibility towards our movement, and that has been a heavy threat for Chinese Communist Party. So this new policy that Chinese Communist Party has come out with of ensuring that millions of Tibetan young children, students are sent to these colonial boarding system is, I wouldn't say it's a new idea. It's something that they must have picked up from other colonial regimes, who have practiced that in their own nations. But I see that as a heavy threat, where now this new generation of Tibetans won't be able to experience, won't be encountered with the true identity as Tibetans, and they might be so far off from the true history and hence the future of Tibet. So I would say that this is certainly challenging for the Tibetan freedom movement, and not just the Tibetan freedom movement, but our allies as well. We have seen the same policy being implemented in other nations that have been occupied, other occupied nations, like Uzbekistan. We've also seen the same thing in southern Mongolia as well. So all I could imply is how dangerous it is, and how Chinese Communist Party is planning many decades ahead now. They've seen movements, they've seen Tibetan freedom movement coming out from young generation. We've seen Tibetan youngsters protesting against the language policies. And I think those have been, must have been the reason why they have realized that now it's important to touch the roots. It's important to attack the roots. So I would say we have to be more urgent than ever. We have to be more vigorous than ever, and we have to make sure that this Tibet issue, Tibet movement, and this Tibet-China cause and conflict is resolved sooner than later. Else, it won't just be a threat for the Tibetan freedom movement, but other occupied nations and allies in the free world who will see its impact on their own countries like India and other Asian countries once this security is tightened and once we see a new form of colonial rule over these occupied regions, territories of China.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Now the next question was to Done.
Yes. Just a few words on the education. As Ms. Namdol just said, this is crucial for the future of Tibet. But what I see in France, for instance, is that the young generation of Tibetans living in France, lots of them are actually studying at universities, and others are working in a very high position in enterprises, for instance. I know of a young Tibetan woman who is working at the OECD, and she's about 25 years old, so she's very promising. So these young Tibetans, they are the future of Tibet. Maybe when Tibet will be, let's say, free again. Now, to answer your questions, Madame Ketka, implosion in China, frankly speaking, is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. That is one tremendous reason. It's nationalism. Of course, there are big differences between the provinces and the regions. The East Coast is developed, while Guizhou and Sichuan are less developed. Also, you have very, very rich people and very, very poor people. So there are differences, enormous differences between the people and also between the areas in China. But all along, the CCP has been adamant at playing nationalism against these tensions, which may lead to an implosion. And if I see what's happening in the recent 2 years, Mr. Xi Jinping is using nationalism more than ever, because he knows that, as I said before, tensions with the West are rising, and awareness of the Western world is growing. So he knows also, he realized that China is now more isolated than never before since a very long time. So China being isolated, the recipe for that is nationalism. He uses nationalism every day with disinformation, with propaganda. But let me end my answer with one thing. Personally, frankly speaking, I don't wish China to implode, because it's a long civilization. The Chinese people don't know what's happening in their own country. They don't know what's happening in Tibet or in Xinjiang. But I hope that one day they will realize what is the fate of China today, what is the corruption in China today. And the future of the world, I think we have to side everyone together to find solutions for tomorrow's world. And we need the Chinese people one day to participate in that debate to find solutions together, because the Chinese people, there is 1.5 billion people. This is more than 1/5 of the entire world population. But one more thing to say, there is already a kind of division between China and Taiwan. This has been a fact since 1949. And when we see the opinion polls in Taiwan, it's very talkative, because you see a fast rising proportion of Taiwanese people who do not want to listen to any offer of negotiations with the mainland to unite and to unify and to be together with the China mainland. And also another thing is that you see in these polls that the identity of being Taiwanese is also rising. There is every year there is a rising proportion of people in Taiwan who feel that they are Taiwanese and no longer Chinese. So this is also revealing. And for me, Taiwan is a truly fantastic democratic country, a very vibrant democracy. And Taiwan is a model for a big portion of Asia. It's actually more democratic than Japan, if you see what the reality there. The role of women in Taiwan is tremendous. For long now, the Taiwanese parliament adopted the law of the same-sex wedding, for example. It's unique in Asia. So Taiwan for me is a model for China to become maybe in 5, 10, 20 years from now.
Thank you. Yes, Kai Mueller.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Kai.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be just very brief, and if I may, I turn your question around regarding changes in Tibet. I think we know everybody knows what kind of policies of change the Communist Party is applying in Tibet, and we've heard some examples already today here. I would like to speak about the changes that the Tibetans continue to aspire through their actions and their resistance, in fact, to policies that are being applied. And first of all, there have been the countrywide protests in 2008, which have really been a milestone and in Tibetan history, an example of Tibetan resistance and aspirations. There's the continuous reverence of the Dalai Lama in Tibet. People are ready to go to jail in Tibet for this reverence, for keeping the Dalai Lama close to their heart. There have been single protests. There have been group protests against mining, against any infrastructure protests all around Tibet, even though people know what they may face, and that is repression, persecution, jail time, torture, and worse. And there have been also protests against local Communist Party measures vis-a-vis monasteries or other religious sites. So all of this shows actually there is resistance and there's a will for Tibetan people to exercise their own aspirations, their own self-determination as a people. And I think this continues. It needs to be continues to be a inspiration, should be an inspiration for any outside observer, and also an acknowledgement of the lack of legitimacy of CCP rule in Tibet. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Eleanor, please.
Thank you for the question. It's an interesting question because we had a debate on this exact topic in the Scottish Parliament last year, and we were able to invite a Tibetan professor onto the panel to share his thoughts. During that discussion, we were focusing on the topic of information and disinformation and the role of technology in both of those. And I was thinking of the phrase double-edged sword, just as you said it, because that's exactly what technology is. It provides a means for authoritarian governments to curtail discussion, never mind political activity, just to curtail discussion within society. But at the same time, it provides a means for people to circumvent government control and to get their point of view across to people on the other side of the world in some cases. And during the discussion we had in the Parliament last year, we were contrasting the situation in Tibet with the situation in Ukraine, because we've seen in the Ukrainian conflict, people are able to live stream what's happening and to show the rest of the world in real time exactly what's happening on the ground. And that's how they counter the disinformation from Russian state media. People in Tibet are living under such tight control that they don't have that same access. It's very difficult for Tibetans to communicate with people outside of Tibet with the same degree of immediacy. It's still possible for Tibetans to get information out, but it's slower, it's much more complicated, and it's at much greater risk to themselves. So it's definitely an interesting topic, but it's one that I found there's a lot of creativity and there's a lot of skill out there. And there are plenty of activists who will keep looking for ways to stay one step ahead of the government. And this is why it's important that any activism movement embraces its young people, because that's where the solutions will lie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, my part of question about development and democracy, I don't have a very big theory with me to share with you, but one thing, as I have noticed history over past many decades, one lesson which I learned that the power of nations and especially the power of dictator nations, the dictatorial regimes is one thing, and the determination of people is totally another thing, and the fate itself is another third factor, or I would say, if I say it in other words, history has its own role. I have seen, or I believe also, that history is a road roller. It has its own way. It cannot be dictated by the biggest of dictatorial powers or the most powerful regimes. When the road roller of history moves, it takes its own direction. It has done. Nobody could ever imagine the fate of Soviet Union. Even the best informed Americans who were dealing every day with the Soviet leaders and had very deep access into their system, even they could not realize 6 months before that it was a hollow nation, that it was going to explode into more number of countries than it was made of. In my neighborhood, as an Indian, we could never imagine there will be Bangladesh. So we see that history, the road roller of history, when it moves, it makes its own way. And one thing which everybody has to remember is that those countries who want, or those societies who have been suppressed, they have to remain present on that day of history, when history makes an announcement that, okay, here is the chance for your liberation, for your freedom. Whoever wants it and who is available should raise hands and you will get it. So this is what happened in Soviet Union. All those countries which were suppressed by the communist system, they maintained their identity, they maintained their determination. They could not express it in so many years of the communist rule, but the day the chance arose, they all raised hands, they said they were present and they got their freedom. So I can say that in China, this is going to happen one day. When the system will explode, the history will come and announce that who wants freedom, who wants to be liberated. My suggestion to my friends, the Tibetan friends, the Uyghur friends, the Mongolian friends, the Hong Kongers, is maintain your identity till that day, maintain your determination till that day. And when the day comes, you will get your freedom. And it will not be a passive thing, it is an active participation by maintaining your determination despite all the pressures, all suppression of the Chinese regime. So I'm not saying that it will be fate which will bring you just sleep and you will get it one day. But I think the history road roller is moving, and I can see the chances, the direction it is taking within China. A, a president like Xi Jinping, a party, almighty party like Communist Party of China, it could not even face blank white papers, A4 size papers. It did not have that much courage. So, a very recent history has shown that these dictators have feet of clay. So, tomorrow, when the Tibetans and their friends join hands in expressing their solidarity with each other, in expressing their desire to see Tibet free, I wish them all the best. And now I think this is time for our friend Tenzin Lamola. She is our co-organizer of this event as representative of Tibetan Youth Congress. And she, as I said earlier, is the she looks after the communications and information of Tibetan Youth Congress. So I will request Tenzin Lamola to please give your perspective on 10th March and also your vote of thanks. Tenzin Lamola, please.
Thank you, Vijay Krantiji. We came to an end of today's webinar, and I think this webinar wouldn't be possible without the support and cooperation from the invited speakers. Therefore, I, on behalf of Tibetan Youth Congress and CHASE, would like to extend our sincere gratitude and thanks to our speakers for speaking on this important topic that honors and remembers the sacrifices of Tibetan men and women who stood against the Chinese occupation in 1959. I would like to thank Kunge Lageri Namge Dogala, member of Tibetan Parliament, Kai Mueller, Anthony Done, and Eleanor for sharing your deep understanding and making sure that the world understand the atrocities committed by the Chinese Communist Party of China. Secondly, I would like to thank Vijay Kurantiji for being so active in organizing our joint webinar and for your support and always being a staunch supporter of Rangzin. Next, I would like to thank Professor Ayushi Ketkar for taking care of the question and answer and contributing to our joint webinar with your intellectual capacity. Next, I would like to thank Lo Sidenla from Tibet Action Institute for taking care of the technical part of our webinar. And at last, I would like to thank to live viewers for taking your time and joining our live stream. With this, I would like to take this opportunity and I would like to remind every Tibetans to take part in tomorrow's 10th March program to commemorate the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising Day. Let us all remember and honor Tibetan martyr men and women who sacrificed their lives for the independence of Tibet. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Tenzin Lamola, for your concluding remarks and your vote of thanks. So once again, thank you, everybody. And to our audience, I assure you that very soon we will be back with yet another edition of uh, the Chase TYC webinar series, and we'll come up with new subjects. And very soon we'll inform you about our next webinar, which will be the 27th in this series. So thank you very much, everybody, especially our speakers, Mr. Done, Kai Mueller, uh, Tenzin Lagari Dulkar, and Eleanor, and of course, Professor Ayushi Ketkar. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.